Okay, let's start. Just a couple of things I want to do today.
Hello, Professor.
Already done one of them. That is to remind you of that test 4 is on Monday. There'll be no class, no regular scheduled class at 12:30 on Monday. You have all day to take the test. And then next Wednesday, a week from today, will be your cystic fibrosis project reports. And the entire class period will be devoted to that. And we'll go through, the groups are all numbered. So we'll go through on Wednesday when you do reports in order that they're numbered. So group 1 will go first. Well, I'd like to share my screen and
Hello, Professor. So sorry for asking. I was a little late. We don't have today a quiz.
that's right, there's no quiz today.
Okay, thank you.
Can you see molecular genetics on your
Yes.
screen? Okay. We went through most of this last time. The topics that I wanted to emphasize were mostly technologies, restriction endonucleases, PCR, and CRISPR. And these technologies, you should know in the case of restriction endonucleases, why the nucleases are different from other depolymerases and how they're used, what a plasmid is, how plasmids are used in molecular biology. Then PCR, what's the key use of PCR? Why is it so valuable? Why is it used so much? Both of those technologies are essential for the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is molecular genetics. And I reminded you the last time about CRISPR and how it works and why it is so valuable. So now we're going to talk about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. So you see a can of corn, right?
Yes.
And you can read the label. And what does the label say?
Registered trademark.
Okay, what else does it say?
Non-GMO.
Right, non-GMO. So what does that suggest?
That the corn contained within is not been genetically modified through direct means.
Right, that's true. But it also, since they're advertising, this is non-GMO, it's a prominent part of the label, that non-GMO is better than GMO.
They mean generally, it's called geometric. No.
Genetically
engineering. Yeah, engineering, like do engineering to DNA.
Yeah, and then we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to start with what you encounter on probably a daily basis. You'll see things labeled, especially food products, non-GMO, as though that's somehow better than GMO, which isn't mentioned. And so what I want to consider today is if that is really a valuable thing to put on a label, and why is it put on labels?
It's important because everybody needs a normal to be normal, not working on genetic.
Okay, that's your opinion at this point. Let's talk a little more about GMOs and see if we conclude what you just said. So there are two ways to make a GMO, a genetically modified organism. One is with an egg and a sperm. So that's traditional breeding. It's been practiced by humans for over 13,000 years. All domesticated plants and animals are genetically modified. For example, dogs. Look at this picture of dogs on the right. All dogs are wolves. The genome of dogs, even the tiniest little dogs, have the genome of a wolf. And yet you see that they're very different in phenotype from wolves. But that's because humans have been genetically modifying them for thousands of years. So that we have all these different phenotypes of dogs. So what accounts, if all of these animals have the same genome, what accounts for the differences that you see?
Phenotype is different
Phenotypes are different, but why?
because they did some mutation, genetic mutation in it.
But the genomes are the same. When they're sequenced, the genomes are the same. So it's not just mutations.
Crossing
The trait is different, like the tall, the size.
Say that again. I didn't quite get it.
I'm saying the trait is different. It's the tall, the size.
Yeah, the phenotypes are drastically different. That's an amazing thing about dog breeds, is that they're so highly variable. They're polymorphic in size and shape and many other things. And yet they all have the same genome. So we've talked about this previously in the course. How do you account for things having the same genome, but having very different phenotypes? Well, it's regulation. So not all genes are on at the same time. In fact, in an adult organism, most genes are off at any point in time. So it all depends on when the genes are turned on and off as to what phenotype you get. So that's how you can take the wolf genome and get all these different phenotypes of dogs. But the more fundamental point I'm making here is that humans have done this. It didn't happen automatically.
Yeah, you mean general selection? That's happened by the environment, but with now the human aid does the natural selection. It's like choose the right trait and keep it.
Yeah, this is not natural selection. This is artificial selection done by humans.
Yes.
Humans have had various different reasons for the types of dogs we have. And so they've selected for them out of over many years, out of a breed of puppies. If one was really aggressive, okay, that puppy was not allowed to breed. It's too much like a wolf. And so we ended up with all these different phenotypes of dogs. But my point is that humans have been genetically modifying organisms for as long as they knew how to do breeding of plants and animals. So that's one way of making a GMO. Another way is with cloned DNA manipulation. Now that technology has only been available since the 1970s, only since we've had access to restriction enzymes and plasmids, and to some extent PCR. So we have new technologies that help us create GMOs in different ways. So I have here in pink an important statement. The difference between traditional GMOs and contemporary ones is not the types of products. It's rather the technology used to produce those products. So that is a central issue that I'm going to talk about today. So let's look at traditional plant breeding down here in the lower left, traditional plant breeding and plant biotechnology. So in traditional breeding, supposing you have two plants, one with yellow genes and one with green genes, and the one with yellow genes has a particular gene that you'd like to take advantage of by putting it into a commercial cultivar, the one with green genes. So what do? You make a cross, put sperm on egg. And what you get is an organism that's half yellow genes and half green genes, including the one you want. And so what you've done is transferred the gene you want plus 50% genes that you don't care about. You got a mixed hybrid genome. I'll contrast that to a GMO, plant biotechnology. You have a plant with a gene that you want in a commercial variety. So what do? You clone that gene using the techniques that we talked about last time, so that now you insert that gene specifically into the commercial cultivar that you want to modify. And now you've made just one change, and you know what that change does. So it's precision plant breeding instead of just mashing two genomes together. And the other point I want to make on this slide is that you can use either technology, egg and sperm, or DNA manipulation. Either one can result in products that you don't want. So for example, in potatoes, there are substances called glycoalkaloids, which are toxic. In fact, the potatoes that you buy in the grocery store have toxic glycoalkaloids in them, but at very low concentration, so they don't harm you. Glycoalkaloid content is polygenic, so if you make a cross, you get a bell-shaped curve. So over time, what plant breeders used to do before GMOs, they would select for what they wanted. And what they wanted in this case is resistance to disease. So they kept selecting for resistance, generation after generation. And what they ended up with is what you see here, that disease resistance is completely correlated to toxicity. So the plants that they ended up with that were disease resistant were too toxic for humans to eat. So my point is that you don't need genetic modification, GMOs, to produce something you don't want. You can do it with eggs and sperm. Okay, what's the official definition of a GMO? It's any organism whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering. It does not occur naturally by mating or natural recombination. Now, notice this definition. It's based entirely on technology, not on the products. It's any organism that's been modified using genetic engineering techniques. So let's look at how it's actually done over on the left. You have a trait of interest, tall plants or short plants, whatever you want, and you isolate a gene that controls that trait. You take that gene and clone it into a plasmid. And we talked last time how you do this, how you make a recombinant plasmid. And then you insert that recombinant plasmid into, in this case, a plant. It could go into an animal, in this case, and there are a number of ways you can get genes into plants or animals. And then you grow up your genetically modified organism. Now, an important point is that if you've used molecular techniques to produce this organism, it has to be tested for efficacy and for safety. And it can't be grown commercially until it's approved by these three government agencies. Environmental Protection Agency, to determine if it's dangerous to the environment. The FDA, to see if it's okay to eat. And the USDA, to see if all the rules have been followed. So this, if you use the techniques of molecular biology, these government agencies all have to approve. However, if you do it with sperm and eggs, none of these approvals are required. So what kind of crops have been genetically modified? The main ones, corn, soybean, and cotton. And you can see in this graph here that now of those three crops, over 90% of those grown in the US are genetically modified. Now, what traits have they been genetically modified for? Well, for managing weeds, controlling insects, preventing crop diseases, or to enhance productivity or nutritional content. And here are a couple examples of how it actually works at the level of the field, commercial production. So some plants have been genetically engineered to be resistant to a non-specific herbicide. You've probably all heard of Roundup. Was initially made by Monsanto. It's more recently marketed by Bayer. Anyway, these are soybeans that are herbicide resistant. They have a gene in them that makes them resistant to Roundup. And here is a patch of weeds that was not treated with Roundup. So the weeds are growing. If they had been treated, the whole field would be free of weeds. Now, similarly, insect resistance is very popular around the world. In this case, here's cotton that on the right, it's been devastated by insects, whereas the cotton on the left has a gene, single gene that encodes a toxin specific for insects. It's not toxic to anything except insects. And so you can see the huge difference that this one single gene makes. And the farmer doesn't have to do anything in either of these cases because the trait is in the seeds. All the farmer has to do is sow the seeds and the crops take care of themselves. Any questions about this?
Excuse me, Professor, there's any research for using people like these with GMO foods or fruits, some fruits, especially in the United States, for the people they are researching that using some people organic things and some people with GMO foods or fruits or foods that they are using?
Sure.
Is there any research result for this usage of these kind of fruits that are with GMO or organic food?
Well, GMO and organic are two completely different things. Organic means that no pesticides have been used.
Yeah.
Whereas GMO means that the plants have been genetically changed.
Yeah, but there is any research result for this because when we see there is a lot of fruits, the taste is changed from the organic. Um, because 3 years before we came from Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, the all fruits and plants are organic, and they are uh, organic. We use it that one, but the taste and smell and everything is different from the GMO. It has some effect on the human health for the with GMO plants or food. I
There is
want to know
no,
that.
there's no evidence that any GMO food it has an adverse effect on health of either plants or animals.
Yeah, I
But
want to
we're
know that.
talking about two different things here. You're confusing um, organically grown
Yeah,
food from GMO food, and they're two completely
yeah,
different things.
yeah, yeah. I got that one. Thank you.
Okay, anything else?
So you said the care between the two different types of plants, the GMO and non-GMO, are similar or exactly the same, or?
For example, like the insect resistance here,
Yeah.
they are exactly the same except for one gene. And that one gene difference was actually cloned from a bacterium. It's a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, and it makes a protein that's very toxic to insects, but it's specific for insects. It has no effect on any other type of organism. So it can be used with impunity for insect resistance in crop plants.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay, the advantages of genetic engineering, in addition to getting the traits that you want, it's faster. It's done in months versus years or decades. The real holdup with GMOs is the regulatory process. It takes years and years to get past. And it's gene specific. So you have no off-target genes in the product. Most GMOs are one gene only, or at most two. And you can be sure of that because you know exactly what you put in to the product. So where are GMOs around the world? Well, all of the green areas here are parts of the world where GMOs are approved. They're both consumed there, they're used, and they're grown there. So all of North America, most of South America, not very many places in Africa, and in Asia and India and Australia. Notice that Europe, Western Europe, largely does not allow GMOs to be grown. If they need them, they will import. For example, the European Union imports huge numbers of soybeans from the US, all of which are GMO. And the same is true of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe and Russia. They will import genetically modified food, but they do not allow farmers to produce it. And it's almost entirely for political reasons. Okay, I'll give you an example. Genetic engineering golden rice to produce vitamin A. In the upper right here, you see golden rice. It's yellow. In comparison with white rice, which is distinctly different in phenotype. And why is golden rice yellow? It's because it overproduces vitamin A. Now go to the left here and read along. Vitamin A deficiency kills 1.5 million people a year and causes blindness in 500,000 children per year in over 120 different countries. Rice provides from 30 to 72% of the energy intake for people in Asian countries. So starting in 2000, a project was undertaken by Ingo Patrikas and Peter Beyer in Europe to make rice that overproduces vitamin A, which is the main component of the diet of so many of these people who are vitamin A deficient, so that they would get vitamin A in the food they eat and could avoid illness and death. So golden rice provides the recommended daily allowance of vitamin A at a daily consumption of 1 cup. 1 cup a day solves the deficiency. The seeds, several large agribusiness companies have the technology now to produce golden rice, and they'll distribute it freely to subsistence level farmers. But it's not grown commercially in any country, as far as I can tell. I'll mention later, there are a couple of countries that have approved it, but it's not grown in the places where it's needed. And why is that? Primarily because of this one organization known as Greenpeace. Greenpeace opposes the use of any GMOs in agriculture, and specifically the cultivation of golden rice, claiming it will open the door to more widespread use of GMOs. So why is it so slow? Well, that's one reason, mainly because of the regulations. The golden rice is available. Only the Philippines and Bangladesh have regulatory approval that was pending last year. I don't know if final approval has been granted in those countries, and that would be for growing golden rice in their countries. So what did Patrikas and Beyer do to produce golden rice? That's shown over here on the right. Here's the pathway for leading to vitamin A. And this would be in bacteria. Rice doesn't have these two enzymes to convert these substrates to products. So they took a gene from daffodil flowers for phytoene synthase, inserted that into rice, and they took another gene from a bacterium, Erwinia iridovera, and inserted that into rice. So rice now has two genes that it doesn't naturally have. And I've got a note here that these genes were put under endosperm specific promoters. So endosperm is a part of the seed, and endosperm specific promoters mean that these genes are on only in the seed, not in any other part of the plant. So vitamin A is produced only in the seeds of rice. And so the point I want to make is here in the middle in pink. We must weigh the benefits versus the liabilities. The benefits, I think, are obvious. I've just gone over it. And what are the liabilities? Well, there aren't any known. The only liability is that Greenpeace and some other organizations are opposed to GMOs, not because of the products, but because of the technology. I just show you this to show you where rice is eaten. This is a highly distorted map, just focusing on rice, which is eaten primarily in India and Asia and Southeast Asia. And these are the countries that do not permit, by and large, do not permit GMO production or even importation in some cases. So golden rice approvals in 2021, US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have all issued approvals. They're not the countries that need golden rice. Proponents estimate that golden rice cannot hit markets in the countries that need it until 2023 or later. And here's a quote directly from a Greenpeace brochure. Greenpeace opposes the release of GE crops, including golden rice. GE crops are prone to unexpected effects, which can pose a risk to environment and food safety. And this is my question. Okay, you're making that claim. What's the evidence? And so far, I haven't seen any. I'd like to just give you one other example that you might be interested in because it has to do with coffee. It's possible to decaffeinate coffee, but decaf's not popular. It doesn't taste very good. So on a worldwide basis, only about 10% of the coffee is decaf. Even though many people would like to have decaffeinated coffee because caffeine has an adverse effect on them, like to have it, but they don't like the way decaf tastes. So how is coffee decaffeinated? Well, there are two main ways. One, you can soak coffee beans in water to remove the caffeine. That usually affects the taste. Or you can use organic solvents like methyl acetate, ethylene chloride. That also really has a bad effect on the taste. An alternative to that would be genetic modification, make a GMO. Create a caffeineless mutant in the lab using, for example, CRISPR. I'll show you here the biosynthetic pathway for caffeine. There are two critical enzymes. They're all three circled in red. You could delete any one of these three and you'd have a caffeine-free plant, and that's the only change that you would make in the plant. So you'd have no caffeine, all the rest of the metabolites, all the rest of the things that affect flavor in coffee would be unaffected. There's been a lot of talk about making a caffeine-free coffee plant. It's never been done to my knowledge, primarily because most of the food companies that would do such a thing fear adverse publicity from people who wouldn't like this technology. If you could do this with sperm and egg, it would be no problem. But if you do it with restriction enzymes or with CRISPR, many people object. So, genetic technology is controversial. As you could see in that the first slide I showed, the can of corn. Food companies go out of their way to claim that their products are non-GMO, implying that GMO are bad. But as I've shown here in pink on the right, there's no case of the toxicity of GM food in any organism, plants or animals. The conclusion, and I'm getting short on time, this controversy completely misses the point. And the point is here in yellow. Each new product should be evaluated on its merits, not by the technology used to produce it. So if the benefits outweigh the liabilities, he might decide it's a good product. If there are more liabilities than there are benefits, he may want to take it off the market, like in the case of the potatoes that were too toxic to eat. And then here's a summary slide I'm not going to go over now because you can do it on your own. And what I'd like to do, this is the end of the molecular genetics. Any questions about molecular genetics in general or GMOs in particular?
Could you remind us what the need for the restriction enzymes are again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you need restriction enzymes for cloning. So let's go back here. So this is making a DNA library. That's here. So you need a restriction enzyme to cleave the plasmid and the DNA you want to clone. So remember, restriction enzymes make these specific cuts at just certain sites, and they're always palindromes. And so
Gotcha.
what you do is take, in this case, EcoR1. Let's go back. EcoR1 here cuts at GAATCC. And so you cut a plasmid with EcoR1, and it leaves these 4 base pair overhangs, TTAA and AATT. You cut the DNA you want to clone with the same enzyme, EcoR1. And so you have, again, what are called sticky ends as overhangs because the cuts are staggered. And so these will anneal. Hydrogen bonds form between the foreign DNA and the plasmid DNA. And then you use ligase to seal the gaps. And you have a chimeric plasmid now that has, it's the plasmid plus the target DNA that you want to clone. You can put this in E. coli then and make as much of it as you want. And so if you imagine doing this to make a GMO, you would take, say, if this foreign DNA was a gene for insect resistance, then you would clone that gene in a plasmid, put that plasmid in a plant, and now the plant would express the gene for insect resistance. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions about genetic engineering or about the ethics of GMOs? Okay, then I'm going to stop sharing this screen. So now you see energy sources.
Yes.
Okay, I want to talk about sources of energy and effects on climate because it's such a critical issue and it affects all life forms on Earth. And this is a biology class. So I think it's appropriate that we consider this issue. And the bottom line message that I want to leave with you is that energy sources can be either combustible or non-combustible. If they're combustible, that means you burn them and they generate carbon dioxide. If they're non-combustible, they don't make carbon dioxide. And I'm going to show you carbon dioxide is not the only problem, but it's the main one. So if you look, ever since temperatures have been recorded, starting in 1880 until the present, the increase in temperature is strictly correlated with production of carbon dioxide, or to put it more generally, with increased in use of fossil fuels. If you look at these temperature charts starting in 1901 until the present, blue means cooler than the average for 100 years. Red means much warmer than the average for the 100 years. And you can see that with time, the US has gotten much, much warmer until now. In the last 2 decades, it's gotten very much warmer. And the same thing has happened all over the globe. And if you look at carbon dioxide levels starting 800,000 years ago, they fluctuated a lot over many millennia. Until recently, the fluctuation stopped and it's gone out of sight. And that is just carbon dioxide, which is the main polluter. It's way ahead of methane, nitrous oxide, and other things that pollute. And so how does carbon dioxide do it? It does it by causing what's called the greenhouse effect. Any of you who've gone into a greenhouse in the summer know that it gets extremely hot because of the heat from the sun is trapped. Same thing happens on the level of our planet. The sunlight strikes the earth. Some of the heat is reflected, but when carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere can form a shield and trap the heat, so that the planet keeps getting warmer and warmer. And the more carbon dioxide we put in this shield, the more heat is trapped. Well, this is the carbon cycle. Well, naturally, where does carbon dioxide come from? From plant respiration and animal respiration. So if you leave human technology out of it, you get carbon dioxide produced by plants and animals respiring. You get rid of it through photosynthesis, the dark reaction. You remember, Rubisco fixes carbon dioxide. And so the cycle continues. But given human activities, mainly the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, a lot more carbon dioxide is produced than can be consumed by photosynthesis. So this carbon cycle is unbalanced. And that's why carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. So I've got a long list here of global threats due to warming. This picture is of a coal mine in West Virginia. And the point is that part of this forest is just completely destroyed by a coal mine. So species facing extinction within the next 30 years, 30% of freshwater species, 40% of amphibians, large mammals, coral reefs are in big trouble. Oak trees, plus 130,000 species of all plants. 60% of all wildlife has been lost in the last 50 years. The causes for this: overhunting, overfishing, overharvesting, destruction of natural habitats, pollution of various different kinds, and the human population itself, it's 7.9 billion now. It'll increase 2 billion more by 2050. That's a 25% increase in humans, and we have to accommodate all of these people. Biodiversity is necessary for a lot of different reasons. And all this makes it seem pretty gloomy, and it is, in my opinion, but there is hope. One is the Paris Climate Agreement, I'll talk about in a minute. And then there are organizations like the Global Deal for Nature, which is a science-driven plan to save diversity and the abundance of life on Earth. According to this plan, there's a 30 times 30 proposal. That is to conserve 30% of the Earth in its natural state by the year 2030. And already 50 countries have signed up to do this. The US is not one of them, but it has a lot of funding from governments, corporations, and foundations. So let's talk about, we'll talk about the Paris Climate Agreement a little later. But first, what is the source of carbon dioxide besides respiration? It's if you burn things. For example, burning gasoline when we drive our cars. So gasoline is primarily octane. It's an 8 carbon compound, completely saturated with hydrogen. So when you drive your car, 2 molecules of octane plus 25 molecules of oxygen give 18 molecules of water, 16 molecules of carbon dioxide, and energy to make your car go. So in addition to global warming, carbon dioxide contributes to depletion of the ozone layer, acidification, and toxicity. A list of some of the effects of global warming: rising sea levels. I've just talked about extinction, behavior of organisms, human health and welfare. You all know that storms are increasing in frequency all over the planet, but including the US, especially in the South. Many more hurricanes each year. There are more named hurricanes. And this is due to global warming. Droughts, economic collapse, ecosystem failure, and even war occurs as a result of global warming, an indirect effect. Now, this is sort of a dramatic illustration of what would happen if all the ice on the planet melted. You have here a map of North America, and you can see the faint blue outline is the current edge of North America. But then you see the edge projected if all the ice at the polar caps melted. So what we would see is the entire Atlantic seaboard would be underwater, the entire state of Florida, much of the Gulf Coast, and the coast of Mexico, some of it. San Francisco would be just a series of islands. And the Central Valley would be a huge bay. And the Gulf of California would stretch north of San Diego. San Diego may or may not be underwater, part of it underwater by that time. And
Definitely the beach areas.
the beach areas, yeah. When you get to the mountains, probably not. But so this is a projection, but it's actually happening. The global sea level has risen 8 inches since 1870. by now, we are in year 2100, 16 to 56 inches, and this has happened more in some places than in others. There are some entire nations, island nations, that will vanish completely as sea levels rise. And I listed a whole bunch of them here that are all in danger of going completely underwater. The other big effect of this is that as seawater goes ashore, it pollutes the groundwater. So many countries like Bangladesh, for example, are having a hard time growing rice because the water that they use for irrigating rice is too salty. And here's an example of an atoll in the Pacific. At one time, it's now underwater. So this all comes down to where we get our energy. Most of it comes from fossil fuels. They are non-renewable and they are combustible. Roughly 75% of energy worldwide comes from burning fossil fuels. Renewable fuels, some are combustible, some are not. The combustible ones account for about 15% of total energy supply. These would include ethanol, biofuels, bio wastes from animals, municipal and industrial areas. And finally, we have the renewable fuels that are non-combustible. And these are only about 5%, maybe a little more than 5% now, of the total worldwide energy supply. And where do we get this energy? From water, from wind, from sun, some from geothermal, very little from tides and waves. They are possibilities, but not really practical at this time. And the remaining comes from nuclear. So the essential point that I'm making is that carbon dioxide accumulation is the culprit. And it will end only when the sources of it are eliminated. In other words, when we stop burning things. So we have to replace combustible fuels with non-combustible ones.
I have a question about the do renewable fuels produce less carbon dioxide than like fossil fuels?
Where are we here?
Ethanol.
Combustible renewables, do they produce less carbon dioxide? No. And that's one of the problems with renewable fuels that are combustible. If you burn them, they're going to produce carbon dioxide. Now, the redeeming feature of combustible renewable fuels is that to produce the fuels consumes carbon dioxide. So for example, to make ethanol, you grow corn and corn fixes CO2. And that carbon from CO2 goes into the ethanol, but then you burn the ethanol. So it's sort of a zero-sum game for combustible renewable fuels. And that's why I'm emphasizing that the real solution is non-combustible. If it doesn't burn, it doesn't produce CO2. All right, I've got pictures here of a lot of different kinds of ways to generate energy. The only ones I put arrows here beside the ones that are truly feasible in action and are in action right now: solar power, wind power, hydroelectric dams, and nuclear power. So as of last year, Germany leads the world in the production of electricity from non-combustible sources. You see that in this diagram. 55% of Germany's electricity comes from non-combustibles, and it's in the form of nuclear, solar, wind, and hydropower. Notice that biomass is not included in that because biomass you have to burn. So the other 45% comes from primarily from fossil fuels, coal and oil and gas. So Germany is leading the world at this point. How does the United States compare? Well, if you look at these charts, about 20%, 19% of US electricity is coming from renewables. And that's all renewables, including the combustible ones. And that breaks down into solar, wind, geothermal, that's energy from inside the earth, hydroelectric, and other is nuclear. So the US has a long way to go to become CO2 free. Thinking of just one segment of the economy, cars, Norway is way ahead of the rest of the world in electric cars, electric plug-ins. So 55% of new car sales in 2019 in Norway were electric, whereas at the same time in the US, it's about 2%. Now, the US has improved since then. In 2021, the rate of electric new cars is 3.5%, up from 2%. So it's moving in the right direction. And something that caught my eye just recently is the Ford F-150 pickup. It's the best-selling vehicle in the world. It has been for 36 years. And it's come out with an electric version this week. In fact, I think it's being unveiled today. And yesterday, President Biden actually drove one. It's a very responsive car. It's got dual motor, one on each axle. It's all-wheel drive, and it has a little gasoline motor called a range extender, so that if you exhaust the batteries and you're not near a plug-in place, you can charge up your batteries with this little gas motor. And this map shows electric vehicle distribution across the country. California has by far the most, and you can see the distribution elsewhere. Interestingly, Hawaii has a lot of them. So looking forward, we need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and I'll show you how much the US government invests in fossil fuels. The thing that we should be trying to get rid of, we're actually promoting by investing, giving them subsidies. We need a carbon tax. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but the Biden administration has just rejoined it. And the main goal of that agreement is to keep the increase in temperature to less than 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So there's a lot of work going on now in carbon sequestration. We're trying to transition jobs from fossil fuels to clean energy. And we need much better battery technology. It's simply batteries are too big and have too low capacity. One of the problems with, well, I'll come to that in a minute. But here you see a wind farm and a solar panel farm. So this is the direction that we should be going. And just this week, there was approval for what's called the Vineyard Wind. It's the largest wind farm in the US to date. It's been approved this month. Where is it? It's off the coast of Massachusetts. Here's Martha's Vineyard. Cape Cod goes up north from here. And this wind farm is out here in the water. These huge stanchions, each with a turbine with 3 blades. Here you can see a picture of some of them. It will enter into service in 2023. It'll generate enough electricity to power 400,000 homes. And interestingly, 1 turn of the blade generates enough electricity for 1 home for 1 day. Now, these towers are 300 feet tall, so think about that. That's the length of a football field. And it's been approved, as I said, this month. So that's a hopeful sign. Now, this is what I wanted to say about thermodynamics, the first law of thermodynamics. And this is really the basis for the problem we have with energy generation. So energy is neither created nor destroyed, it only changes form. So we have forms. Fossil fuel is one form. It's concentrated energy. The energy was fixed millions of years ago by photosynthesis. And so it concentrated the carbon. Now all we have to do is light a match. It's immediate. We get immediate heat and light and energy from it. Now, renewable energy, no matter where it comes from, is in a different form. And it's too diffuse to do work, and it must be concentrated. In other words, you have to change its form. And we're doing that with solar panels, wind turbines, and other machines that can change energy, change the form of energy. So one of the reasons that fossil fuels have been so popular in the past and continue to be is because it's very convenient. The energy is already concentrated. All we have to do is burn it. Whereas to use non-combustible forms is more involved. And in the past, and even continues to be more expensive, although the cost of energy from non-combustible forms is going down rapidly. Now I want to make a comment about international political implications of non-renewable energy. This is based on a lecture given by my son, Brandon. He's a professor of political science at the Australian National University in Canberra. He's currently in Singapore, but his professional interest is US-China relations. Well, it turned out that I was giving a series of lectures in Tokyo on, and one of my topics was climate change. And Brandon he planned, he stopped in and contributed to one of my classes. And so I've taken a few screenshots from some of the things he said. So this, for example, is one of his slides. Political implications of non-renewable energy, in other words, fossil fuels. Dependence on fossil fuels promotes international conflict. In other words, it causes countries to fight with each other, and it promotes dictatorships. This elaborates on those 2 points. Oil production is easy for a government to control directly. It reduces the government's dependence on a domestic economy for taxes. All it needs is revenue from oil. And it allows the government to keep pro-democratic groups poor and weak. Now this, the point here is that most countries are consumers, especially the large industrialized countries. And of the consumers, only Russia and Canada produce more fossil fuels than they use. All the rest of the countries, industrialized countries, produce less than they use, which means that the international demand for oil is high and remains high. So the world economy is now and has been for a long time based on fossil fuels, burning them. So countries with oil-based economies, the government owns the wealth. So the allegiance of the government is to the global market, not to the citizens of the country. And this then fosters authoritarian regimes. In contrast, countries with diversified economies, not based entirely on oil, the wealth is owned more broadly. The allegiance of the government tends to be to its citizens, and this fosters democracies. And Brandon showed an interesting slide. This is democracy index, that is how democratic a country is, plotted against the percent of its tax revenues from oil. So starting with countries that have almost entirely revenues from oil to countries that have almost none. And what you see here is that the oil-rich countries, these are primarily in the Middle East, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Nigeria, Kuwait, Angola. Here's Iran, United Arab Emirates. These are all relatively undemocratic regimes. Venezuela and Russia fall in the middle, and Canada and Norway, even Norway has a lot of oil, it doesn't use it for its economy. Canada has very little oil, and they are much more democratic in terms of their governments. So this is a direct correlation that is, and the line is statistically significant. So the point is that dependence on oil fosters authoritarian governments.
Where does the US fall on that?
It's up here with Norway and Canada. I can't remember why he didn't include it, but it's somewhere up at this end. So what's the solution? The international political problems of energy. Well, one thing, we can reduce energy consumption. Well, you know that's not going to happen. Can sign treaties that guarantee access to fossil fuels through trade. And I've mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement, which limits global warming to less than, the goal is to limit it to less than 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial revolution. And the third is develop not just renewable, but non-combustible energy sources. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement, it's been a struggle starting in 1992. There have been all these international meetings trying to come to some agreement on how to deal with climate change. And the most recent one was in Paris in 2015. So what's the status of the Paris Agreement after 5 years? Well, this fellow, Michael Oppenheimer from Princeton, said this: the grade for the Paris Pact, based on the prospects of meeting this 2-degree target, is either D or F. In other words, it's not working. Some countries are promising to cut their net climate emissions to 0 by 2050. These countries are listed here. The US president has endorsed this target, but hasn't signed anything. China is the greatest polluter. He has said, well, it will aim for carbon neutrality by 2060. Russia and Brazil, also big polluters, have rejected the Paris Agreement. So the problem is there are terrific ambitions, good intentions, but essentially no enforcement. So every country in the world would have to do all these things, but each country is allowed to make its own plans to accomplish these goals, and there's no penalty if they don't. And there's a phenomenon that Brandon likes to talk about, which is, I can't remember the name of it, but the whole idea is that, okay, we're all in this together. If you guys all do it, then I don't have to. So if every country takes that attitude, and most of them are now, no progress is made. The political power of non-renewables. So this is in the US. Political giving. Political action committees can contribute to whoever they wish. And if you look at contributions for the oil and gas industry, these are the gray bars, as opposed to the renewable energy industry, the red bars, almost insignificant from private contributions. Lobbying groups at the federal level, the oil and gas industry has its lobbyists, renewable energy has its lobbyists, and again, you can see that there's a huge difference in the amount of money going into lobbying for the fossil fuels as opposed to renewable energy. And if we look at US energy subsidies, now this is subsidies from the government to the various different sectors. Carbon capture a little bit, renewables a little bit, corn ethanol. This is not really a good idea, but government subsidizes it and corn farmers are getting rich from it. Fossil fuel, it's a huge subsidy compared to everything else. And so begs the question, why are we subsidizing fossil fuels when, first of all, they don't need the subsidies, and secondly, we'd like to be de-emphasizing them for the good of the planet. Well, I'm out of time. Carbon capture, this is the diagram. Here's an actual carbon capture plant in Saskatchewan, Canada. The idea is that you capture carbon from a fossil fuel burning plant and store it underground. And apparently this is a real possibility for reducing carbon if it were done on a massive scale. A carbon tax. This is a very appealing idea. Doesn't have a lot of political traction, but what is a carbon tax? It replaces the income tax with a carbon tax. And the carbon tax is based on the carbon footprint of each individual or group. So imagine that right now, in the way it has been, we're taxed primarily on the income that we make. So the more money you make, the more tax you pay. And the idea of a carbon tax is that you replace that with a tax on the carbon you produce. So the more carbon you produce, the higher your tax. So it would be a complete change. And this has been tried in a number of different places. And the consequences have been, I've listed them here. Countries that have tried this have had a drop in fuel consumption, a decline in carbon dioxide, no effect on economic growth, and it's revenue neutral. In other words, if you simply replace carbon tax or replace personal income tax with a carbon tax, it's a zero-sum game. And this map shows the countries in the world that have carbon taxes. It's the Scandinavian countries and England and Ireland and Australia. All the other countries have either nothing or some variation of that, which is less effective. And I'm out of time, so let me just say one thing. You're probably asking, okay, what is a carbon footprint? The answer is it's very complicated. And so there are lots of ways to calculate carbon footprints. I've X'd them out, and I'm recommending instead, if you want to know your carbon footprint, you can go online and look up a carbon calculator. Okay, let's see. Yeah. Okay, that's all I have to say. And I've gone over time. Apologize for that. Any questions or comments? Monday is test 4, and there'll be no class at 12:30. You have all day to take the test. And next Wednesday, a week from today, are your project reports. Okay. If nothing else,
I have a quick question for Scott, actually.
okay.
Scott, are you doing workshop before you have to do the previews later?
Yes, typically on these days, the first hour is for students that have questions about
Oh.
class.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, anything else? Scott's workshop starts at 2, which is just a few minutes from now. All right, if nothing else, I'm going to stop sharing and end the session.